Hello again, 101. In this video, I will talk about the overall parameters of this chapter 16, the growth of big business and organized labor in the post-Civil War period. And make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, big business radically changed the United States, leading the United States to become the world's leader in manufacturing. And as a result of that, the majority of Americans came to be workers in these various factories and working in coal mines or in steel mills rather than being agriculturalists. And by 1920, this is a statistical fact as well. The growth of big business made manufactured products and industrial resources like electricity widely available to Americans, and it greatly improved American lives. Electricity radically changed American lives. Now it's not necessary to have sunlight in order to operate. Businesses were able to operate around the clock using the artificial light created by electricity. And as a result of the growth of big business, unfortunately, wealth became concentrated in the hands of a relatively few corporate leaders like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie in their respective oil and steel businesses, and the big financier J.P. Morgan, who really was one of the huge bankers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What were some of the goals of these big business tycoons? They wanted to bring order and stability to the various sectors, mainly their markets, the oil market or the steel market in particular. And by doing this, they're going to increase their profits and they're going to destroy their competitors. So the big strategies they used were three. They want to become a monopoly, avoid government regulation, and maintain these monopolies. And as a result of trying to avoid government regulations, one of the big inventions of the 19th century was the idea of the limited liability corporation. Why limited liability? All that they are liable for are the assets of the corporation, not their personal wealth, not their personal homes. If the business went bad, creditors would only be able to seize those assets and not anything else. And without this idea, the growth of big business really wouldn't have been possible. The trust was created to grant authority to manage people's investments or companies, and they paid annual dividends, and people were quite pleased with the returns they got by investing in trusts. The sugar trust, the beef trust, there were endless trusts created in the 19th century, which again led to the concentration of wealth being in relatively fewer and fewer hands. And going hand in hand with these strategies are going to be some ideas on different positions within the American society. Most of these big business people favored a very high tariff because it protected their industries. It protected their trusts. They favored the gold standard or a hard currency. They wanted gold backing any of that paper that was out there circulating in the economy. And as a result, in the 19th century, there is a perpetual currency shortage. If you had money, it was quite valuable, but it was difficult to obtain because of the practices of government with deflation. There's never enough money to go around because it had to be backed by gold. And they sought to avoid regulation. So the main big business where industry really started to grow in the 19th century was in rail. And the railroads came to be seen by the general public as the bad guy in the American society because of their power. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, many tracks were then laid trying to connect to that main trunk that connected Chicago with California. And it affected all kinds of different industries. Steel. Carnegie made a fortune building railroad tracks. Oil eventually will replace steam as the engine of the railroads. And these gentlemen greatly profited from those businesses. And they did not want to see these railroads regulated whatsoever. And Rockefeller especially took advantage of the rebate, where railroads would give him a discounted rate because he did so much business with them, the volume of business that he did. And the railroads believed that it was a better idea then to give him a better rate than the farmers who were seeking to use the same railroads to get their products to market actually were paying more than Rockefeller was to move his different oil-related products to where they had to go. And this last goal here, to maintain a monopoly, don't think that these corporations were inefficient, because they weren't. They were continuously innovating. They're always looking to reduce cost. They're always investing in new technology, and that's why they continue to grow and they got so big. And they always want to eliminate waste wherever possible. But going hand in hand with that, they also exploited their workers in order to have costs being lowered. They never wanted to close a steel mill. It operates most efficiently when those furnaces are always running and up to temperature. That means you got to have somebody watching them 24 hours a day. That's a tough job when you're working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They also would try to bribe and control public officials through campaign funding or other contributions. And big business did some positive things, such as making electricity widely available and completing the railroad and making many other goods and services available to a vast scale larger than ever before in American history. But these things also went along with them. So what happened to the general public? What happened with them? There's reactions to big business. And before we get into that, again, we can say that it created millions of jobs, which lessened unemployment, which happens sometimes in the agricultural sector. There's good times and there were bad times, or boom bust times, and when you're a farmer. And it would be the same thing eventually in industry as well. But at this time, in the late 19th century, there is not going to be a real downturn until the 1890s. There's a panic in 1873, but the big depression happens in the 1890s. And because of the economy of scale of these monopolies, most of these products were available to many Americans at a very affordable cost. We talked about the economic inequality, with 10% statistically controlling 75% of the wealth by 1900. You had big business, 318 holding companies. That was a Rockefeller innovation, the holding company, which got around the Sherman antitrust law that was created in 1890 to try to regulate monopolies. And eventually that Sherman Antitrust Act is actually used against labor unions, which were trying to be formed to try and improve the condition of workers, trying to get shorter hours of work and to get better pay or wages for those union members. Those are the three perennial demands of labor: better wages, better conditions, and better hours. And it corrupted the two major parties. Again, the public appreciated the innovations, they embraced the employment opportunities, and that was evident in the watershed election of 1896 when McKinley swamped William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, and that reaffirmed the control of the Republican Party for another generation until basically the stock market crash of '29 and the onset of the Great Depression. But again, this was not a very competitive world. The perfectly competitive world where there's many suppliers of goods and services in a market did not really exist. There was usually the one or maybe a few competitors in a market. Eventually, the goal, the Progressive Era, as we'll see, we'll get into that chapter in a couple of weeks, they attempted to outlaw some of these corrupt big business practices like the rebate offered by railroads or the holding company and the monopoly, and they will try to regulate business, and there will be different viewpoints from Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson towards how this should be done. Officials usually supported these big business entrepreneurs and tycoons. And they eventually would, and politicians will actually send in troops to suppress strikes, such as the Homestead Steel Strike in Pennsylvania in 1892 and the Pullman Rail Strike, led by Eugene V. Debs, a dedicated socialist who believed that labor unions could improve the lives of Americans. And he was right, they did. It eventually leads to the development of the middle class for all American citizens working. But media, mainly the newspapers, will end up portraying these labor union leaders as being anarchists at worst, socialists at the mild description, such as Debs. He was jailed after this strike, and in jail he became a socialist. And he will actually run for president, culminating in his 1912 candidacy, where he polled over 800,000 votes, and that's the best he did. But even then, that's the watershed high point of the socialist movement in the United States, because the general public, because of the violence of some of these strikes, not just Homestead and Pullman, but also Haymarket in the Chicago area in the 1880s, I think that was 1886, that also had violence where police officers were killed. And the general public came to believe that these people were radicals, and they didn't really support them until the 1930s, when the Wagner Act will legalize union activity. And as a result of this, then, these entrepreneurs will largely support laissez-faire. They would like to see government not get involved in the nation's economy at all. And most of the officials that were in government then supported those ideas. It's going to be development by business and individuals, not by government-generated economic growth. So what were the overall growths? To become a monopoly, to avoid government regulation, and to maintain those monopolies through innovation and cost reduction. How did they do that? Mainly through using holding companies, getting public officials on their side, maybe even bribing them if need be, and trying to maintain a laissez-faire economy. There was economic inequality as a result, but great employment opportunity. And as a result of that, by 1900, there is a general public clamor for some sort of regulation of big business. Workers will then begin trying to organize themselves. At first at the industry-wide level, which becomes the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, mainly led by John L. Lewis, the miner, and the American Federation of Labor, led by Gompers, the cigar maker, who believed in craft industries, unionization of skilled workers only. He felt they had a better bargaining position. And number 4 here in the topics, that's the only thing we really didn't talk about so far. The social class structure will be dominated by these people. And the role and lives of women at this time, they're going to seek the ballot. They're going to seek being able to vote. And that's the main thing they focus on in the late 19th and early 20th century.